press record now. I have pressed record, and I am going to pass over to you, Denise. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin, and good morning, everyone from Perth. Before we start, just a couple of things about the webinar today. The focus is on the impact of WIL and employability-related activities on graduate employment. We're not focusing on employability outcomes, so things like skills development, feeling prepared for future work and that type of thing. We are simply focusing on employment. We are planning a second webinar in a few months where we'll drill down more into the employability outcome space. And also, while we'll briefly introduce the items that ACEN included in the GOS, we're not making that a focus, the methodology, the nature of the items and the data collection process. So, and we haven't really got time to cover that. So if you have got questions relating to the actual items themselves or the data collection process, please feel free to contact me after the webinar. And I think a question's just, or a chat's just popped up about the slides, and yes, they will be available after the session. So in terms of the purpose, we're really looking at and drilling down to whether WIL enhances graduate employment outcomes, and if so, how. Can we justify resourcing WIL, given that it is known for being some types of WIL can be resource intensive? And what's the value add of WIL, if any, compared to other employability focused activities, which might be extra or co-curricular? And also throughout the webinar, we'll highlight some areas where institutions, your own survey teams or areas that manage the GOS might want to further explore the data, because this may vary. We're obviously giving you a national picture rather than an institution-focused one. Just a bit of background. So ACEN introduced 5 items into the 2020 GOS, and you can see the different collection points there. Of our members, we have 30 participating member universities, which is great, and we have a sample of 80,000 graduates. We are continuing on. We're in field at the moment for the 2021 GOS, and we have 31 institutions participating this time round. Obviously, as most of you probably know, the GOS is administered by the Social Research Centre, and Lisa Bolton's joining me, obviously presenting today. She'll be presenting in the second half of this webinar. The items themselves, they are available in full detail in the summary report, which there's a link to in the webinar blurb. But just briefly, you've got 5 different items. The first one around participation in WIL, and WIL being, WIL is where you have obviously industry and community engagement embedded in the curriculum, so it's a formal component of the course, mandatory or elective. And we looked at 3 different types of WIL: workplace-based, WIL that's not in the workplace, so projects, consulting, etc., and global WIL. Now, we did have some debate when these items were developed around how we classified that, but that's what we're using and what we're using this year as well. In terms of second item, it was really about the impact of WIL on different dimensions of employability. And as I said, we're not focusing on that today. That will be the topic of a later webinar. Also, participation in not-for-credit employability-related activities. So these might be things that are facilitated by the university through co-curricular arrangements or their extracurricular activities. And they are listed there, and you'll see those keep flashing up on the screen. So, but that's the coverage, the scope that we looked at for those different employability-related activities. I'm going to refer to them as ERAs hereafter, because it's a bit of a mouthful. We also looked at participation in paid work while studying. And then the final item, which is really our focus for today, is the influence of WIL on employment outcomes. I'm going to give you the key takeaways up front, and then, because there's a lot of data, and then we'll tell our story of how we came to these key takeaways, or how the data did, and then I will recap on these at the end. So we found from the data that WIL has a clear positive effect on full-time graduate employment at an undergraduate level, and particularly workplace-based WIL. We also saw some clear, those clear positive effects of WIL on full-time employment, however, were not apparent at postgraduate level, and that's postgraduate coursework and also postgraduate research. We did, however, see a positive impact of WIL on perceived overqualification. I'll talk about what exactly that means. during the webinar, and that was at all course levels. We saw varying effects of ERAs on full-time graduate employment at an undergraduate level. And also, likewise, we saw varying effects of ERAs on perceived overqualification at all course levels. And so I guess an overarching conclusion for us was really that embedding WIL into undergraduate curriculum appears more likely to produce positive graduate employment outcomes, and there's a range of different outcomes that we'll talk about, depending on the nature of the extracurricular and co-curricular offerings that an institution is facilitating and encouraging in its students. So exactly how we came to those conclusions, just unpacking those. So this is the only slide. I'll just give you a heads up, it's a bit difficult to read, and thankfully I'm not spending too much on it anyway. This actually is in the summary report. This was our fifth item, one of ACEN's own items that we included. And it was really looking at the impact of WIL in different ways on employment. And you can see on the so this is people that undertook WIL. You can see on the right-hand side that just over half of all graduates that completed WIL said none of those effects, those three effects to the left, were in place. It didn't have an impact on their employment outcomes in those three ways. Now, just remembering that the GOS is administered at 4 to 6 months post graduation. So the course level, the overall course level is in orange, and then you've got your different course levels here. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it is in the summary report. In terms of breaking that down further, around a quarter of the graduates that completed WIL said they did secure employment because of an experience gained during WIL. Around 15% secured employment with their actual WIL industry community partner, and around 10% said they secured employment through a network contact made during the WIL experience. And you can see those results are fairly stable by course level. So I guess the impression we get there is not, when we take the fact that 50% said they didn't have any of those effects, although 25% did say they secured employment, it's not an overly positive picture. What we did then, and which is what we're spending more time on today, is we drilled down into the data. We mapped our participation in WIL and ERAs against the GOS measures for employment outcomes, which if you're familiar with the GOS, you'll know these measures well. The first ones being full-time employment and overall employment. So full-time employment is where a graduate indicates that they're available for full-time employment and they manage to secure full-time employment. And you'll see these percentage figures. These are what are used largely in league tables, so the Good Universities Guide, and that's what's used to define the star ratings for universities in terms of their employment outcomes. So we obviously want this to be as high as possible. So just focusing on the left here, you've got your different types of WIL. So this is if they participated in any form of WIL. You've got your three different types there and did not participate in WIL at all. So you can see here, and this is undergraduate level, just over 70% of graduates that participated in any form of WIL gained full-time employment, compared with 63.5% who didn't manage to secure, who didn't participate in WIL but did manage to secure full-time employment. So we can see that kind of clear positive effect there. Overall employment is employment of any kind. It can be part-time, full-time, contract working, etc. And again, there's a positive effect there, although it's not as strong for overall employment compared with full-time. Moving down to the employability-related activities, for those graduates that participate in any form of ERA, you can see that 66.7% of those gained full-time employment, as opposed to those that did not participate at all in any, that gained 68%. Now, at that point, you might be scratching your head thinking, how can ERAs have a negative impact on employment outcomes? And I do need to stress here, again, that we're focused on employment outcomes, not employability, as in skill development and feelings of preparedness, etc. We'll unpack this further in a moment, but I just want to highlight the variations here. You can see that some ERAs were more effective than others, particularly leadership and award programs, and obviously industry mentoring. While enterprise incubators are positive, I just need to flag the low count here, so we need to kind of treat these figures with caution. And moving across to overall employment, we've got a similar story for the eras as well. So you can see those that participated in any era, 84% secured any type of employment, and really there wasn't a negative effect there, but there was no effect. But again, there's some variation within the different types of activities that a graduate might engage in. So we wanted to unpack this further, and we did look at the kind of whether there was an interaction effect. Basically, if a graduate undertook WIL at university and ERAs, how did that compare with if they only did one or the other? So just seeing here, you can see if a graduate didn't undertake any ERA at all, and they didn't undertake any form of WIL, their employment outcomes averaged out 64.9%. Those with the highest full-time employment rate were those that just did a form of WIL and no employability-related activity. And then you can see just underneath that, if they did both, then obviously they were up there, very comparable with those that just did WIL, and those that did just the ERA and no WIL. You can see their percentage figure there. So how do we explain this? Because that it is a surprising figure, and I have to say, looking at our own institution that I'm in as well, our figures actually mirrored this as well. So I think there's a couple of explanations we can draw on. First of all, if we visit the literature around extracurricular activities, there has been some evidence that students that spend too much time perhaps on extracurricular activities, and in view of the fact that they're trying to develop themselves as a rounded graduate, which we know employers want, sometimes that can have a negative impact on their academic studies. And that might be particularly so for students that have lots of work commitments, perhaps low SES students that have heavy workloads or heavy paid work commitments, and also students have caring commitments, etc. So it might highlight inability to juggle effectively. There's an influence, a negative influence on their academic outcomes. Let's say it's a lower grade point average, for example, and that can then impact on their employment outcomes. Impact in the sense that having a lower GPA might signal to employers lesser capability, potential capability in the workplace, or it perhaps might reduce a graduate's confidence when they actually come to seek employment. So there could be something there, and I would encourage institutions to have a look at what's happening in their own data, because certainly that variation that we saw earlier in the different eras could have something to say here. Now, the other lens I suppose we can look at this through is this really highlights the value of WIL on employment outcomes. So why would that be, and why would that be different to ERAs? Now, we know that quality WIL is built on things like quality feedback from industry or community partners, reflective activities where students really think carefully and ponder on how their professional practice relates to classroom-based learning, making sense of this, relating it to themselves, what are their career goals, what are their strengths, their weaknesses, what's their passion. And also some WIL activities will include things like portfolios, where students are able to create a personal narrative around what their career goals are and better position themselves to prospective employers. And that might be that whole pedagogical approach, which is linked to quality WIL, might be where the added value is. That would be one way to interpret the data we see here. Moving on at a postgrad level, there isn't the same story. So those that participated in any form of WIL, you can see their full-time employment rate there, 81.9%, compared to those that didn't. So essentially, those that didn't do WIL were better off. Now, why would that be? And that's also the same for overall employment, although to a lesser extent. This might be something to do, it could be to do with WIL design, but perhaps more likely it could be due to the cohorts. We know that a lot of postgraduates work, and it might be that those that choose to do WIL don't have employment while they're studying, and then they're in a lesser position, I suppose, to secure employment in the short term, remembering this is 4 to 6 months post-graduation. Moving down to the employability-related activities, similar type of message there. So those that participated, you've got 80% secured employment. Those that did not participate, it actually is a higher full-time employment rate there. So again, why would that be? It could be returning to our argument around, or our assertion that perhaps it's the pedagogy, that there isn't the reflective component and the sense making and the feedback built into that activity, although that doesn't seem to be the case with these ones here in the middle. And that actually would make sense. Industry mentoring, leadership award programs, they are built on and around reflective activity and creating a personal narrative, which might be why they also do, they fare better. Again, this impact here might also be due to the postgraduate cohort. They simply didn't engage in those activities, the ones that already had employment, which means that they just transitioned straight into their employment that they already had while they were studying. A similar story here, so I'm not going to go into this in detail because of time. So again, we looked at the interaction effect here, and that really just, really we can, to understand this, it would be a question of revisiting those kind of points that we just made earlier. Those that did the best were actually those that didn't undertake any employability-related activities and didn't complete any form of WIL. So again, it could be specific to the postgraduate cohort that are already in employment. And we can see that those that completed WIL are the next ones down in terms of rates of employment postgraduate, after graduation. Postgraduate research, sorry, I should have said that that was postgraduate coursework. Postgraduate research, we can see very little impact here. Although interesting for coursework and for postgraduates in research, there did seem to be a bit more of a positive effect for global WIL. You might, from that, you might think, okay, well, not many postgraduates so maybe undertake a global WIL experience, and maybe that's something that where they're able to differentiate themselves from other graduate recruits, when they're during recruitment processes, and to gain positional advantage in the market, possibly. And similar for overall employment, we're not seeing a big effect there. Similar story to the coursework in terms of full-time employment for those that participated. It's actually lower, than those that actually did not participate. So again, we've got a similar story here. There's variation here in the middle, although being mindful of counts here of numbers of graduates actually participated in those different activities. And the interaction effect here, so these are, very comparable. So even if they undertook either, or if they just, neither of them, or they just undertook WIL, we're looking at more positive employment outcomes. I guess the argument with HDR graduates is really, you could argue that perhaps spending more time on the development of their thesis, academic publishing, might hold them in better stead for employment rather than ERAs and WIL. That might be the case if they're heading for academia, but not perhaps if they're heading into industry. So again, drilling down into your own institution's data and relating that back to the actual employability-related activities that you offer. Maybe you have a very well-established leadership and award program, for example, which is built around feedback and reflection, and you specifically analyse the impact of that participation in that one activity. It could be worthwhile. Moving on to another type of employment outcome, which is overqualification. I'm going to hand over to Lisa in a moment, who's going to unpack this further. Overqualification is really around graduates' perception of how well they are utilising their skills and knowledge in their current role. And I should have flagged earlier that all of this data, as per the summary report, is all around domestic graduates. And for this one, for overqualification, it's only for graduates that are actually in full-time employment. So with overqualification, there's what we call the SPOC scale, which is the scale of perceived overqualification. And it's a set of 8 items which relate to skills, ability, and education. And it really asks graduates to consider whether in their current role they're fully utilising the skills and knowledge and that they develop during their degree course. So obviously and with that they take an average, and there's an algorithm that's used to classify that graduate as whether they feel overqualified or whether they don't feel overqualified. And really that's an indicator of whether they're in graduate level employment. So our goal, as every institution, is to get that as low as possible. We want as few of our graduates to feel overqualified in their current roles as possible. So here we're looking at the impact of WIL on the perceptions of overqualification. First of all, we've got the undergraduate level. Now, the result here is very strong and positive. You can see that those that participated in any form of WIL, 23% of them felt that they were overqualified, compared to 37% that did not participate in WIL. They felt that they were overqualified in their current job. And you can see some differences there. Workplace-based WIL obviously producing the most positive impact, I suppose, on feelings of being overqualified. In terms of the eras, there is an effect, but it's small. So, you know, there is if you did participate in an era or any form of era, you're less likely to feel overqualified than those who didn't do any at all. But you can again see that difference there. Mentoring and award programs, you know, really having an impact on the extent to which a graduate felt overqualified compared with some of the others. And this, I'll take volunteering as an example here, because some of the percentage points for volunteering haven't been very favourable through the slides, you may have noticed, and that's not in any way to detract from the good work that careers and employability teams are doing in terms of facilitating volunteering hubs and encouraging students to volunteer. We're focused, remember, on employment outcomes. You know, it might be a different story in regards to building confidence or building preparedness or skill development, etc. But also, you might think, okay, volunteering doesn't have that whole, perhaps it doesn't have that whole reflective component and feedback component to it. Obviously we're not able to drill down to the data that in that level of detail. So that's something to think about. In terms of the postgraduate levels, you can see the same strong effect of work integrated learning, any form, in terms of perceptions of overqualification at coursework level, and to a lesser extent at the HDR postgrad research level. And again, negligible here overall in terms of participating in any of those areas. But again, there's variation here, which encourages institutions to really drill down to their own data and see what's happening for their particular, you know, cohort of graduates. An interaction effect. So essentially, if the best case scenario in terms of the fewest graduates that felt overqualified would be if they did WIL only. If they did both of those, and you can see it's slightly more of those would have felt overqualified. And again, this might, you know, there is a fairly strong argument in this data about the value of WIL for steering graduates into graduate level employment and avoiding underemployment, which I think is a key message from this data. But certainly there are some areas which seem to be you know, paving that pathway for graduates as well, which is a good outcome. Okay, at this point I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to pass over to Lisa to drill down a bit more into the overqualification space.
Hi everyone, yes, Lisa Bolton here from the Social Research Centre, and in my inimitable style I'll have some graphics here that are quite complicated, so I'll explain to you what they're saying, and certainly you'll have access to this. And I'm getting a little bit of feedback. It might be somebody with their microphone on. Hopefully it's not coming from me. So in terms of this graphic, we've got the scale of perceived overqualification scale score, and you can see that effect that Denise was talking about. So where it says false, these are people who haven't undertaken any of the 3 work integrated learning activities that were listed. So the workplace, not in the workplace, or the global. So where it says false here, they've said they had not participated in those WIL activities. And what that shows is that 37% of those who didn't undertake those activities reported that they were overqualified. And what you have here are the breakdown of the 8 items underneath that scale score. So you can see that there's a number of them where the gap between those who'd participated in WIL and those who hadn't is actually quite large. So you see 12.9 percentage points for the item, my job requires less education than I have. 11 for I have more job skills than are required for this job. 13.8, someone with less education than myself could perform well on my job. So we're seeing that those who've participated in those work integrated learning activities are much less likely to be reporting those things. There's two items where the gap is not quite as big, and they're around whether their training's being fully utilised, and the gap is a bit smaller about someone with less educational or work experience than themselves could do the job just as well. But I think those results are somewhat telling. Now let's see, I just have to remember to press a button. Here we go. Now, sorry, you will have access to this. Sorry, it might be a bit hard to read. What I've done is broken it down by study area. And I think that when we're talking about the effects of work integrated learning on employment outcomes, it is best to take into account the study areas that the students are coming from. Now, what we've got are a number of study areas where students are required really to undertake WIL rather than have the option to undertake it. And so I'm just going to show you a slightly different view of this. And what we've done is to the left of the screen up to dentistry, those are the study areas that are considered to be in inverted commas vocational. So these are the study areas where students tend to go straight from their course into a full-time job, more so than more generalist courses like science and mathematics, humanities, psychology, law and paralegal, those sorts of areas. And what we also see in that differential between those different study areas are other things that factor in. So one of the other things that factor in, particularly when you're looking around humanities, science and maths, etc., is the number of students whose focus is not full-time employment immediately after their undergraduate program, but those who are intending to go on to further study. So they're probably less likely to undertake WIL if they're intending to go on to further study. And where they've done those employability-related activities, it's probably to develop their skills for their course that they're going to apply into further study rather than directly into a workplace. So those things are all well worth considering. In terms of which areas have performed the best, things like dentistry, you can see only 1.4% of those students, that's in rehab and dentistry, have said that they are overqualified for the job that they find themselves in. Rehab is also very low, veterinary science, medicine, those kinds of programs. You can see, especially for those who say they have undertaken WIL, we assume that most of them did, and some of them maybe misinterpreted the question, but certainly there is a fairly large differential for quite a few of those. We see it less in some other areas, like in health services, teaching, nursing, and maybe that's because most of them really did do WIL and just aren't reporting it adequately. So that's worth just keeping it in the back of your mind. But you can see, even in a generalist area like science and mathematics, there is a fairly large differential between those who say they have undertaken WIL, still 30.9, but compared to 47.6, so nearly half who didn't undertake WIL say that they're not utilising their skills and knowledge in their current role. Now, to some degree, in some of these areas, those differences are around accreditation processes. So psychology is always, or can always be problematic, particularly for undergrads, because they really need an honours or a practitioner year or whatever they need to do to get their accreditation to work properly in their area. In humanities, about 25% of those graduates are still going on to further full-time study. Science and mathematics, one of the underlying areas there is medical technology and biological sciences, and something like 46% of those are going on to further full-time study. So I would strongly recommend, when you're looking at these outcomes, to look at those who didn't participate in WIL, but take into account the study area that you're talking about, because in fact I think the experience is quite a bit different depending on that study area. Oh, she says I keep trying to press my keyboard and that doesn't work. So what we've done here is just take those study areas to the left, and you can see that for the most part in all of these items, the gap is not enormous, and their likelihood of reporting that they're overqualified is quite a bit lower. So if you were looking at your WIL data, your ACEN data in your data set, take into account the profile of the students that you are looking at compared to the profile of everyone. It's well worth looking at these things at the study area level because they will be behaving differently. So if I go, yeah, these are those courses to the right, that undergraduate elective WIL areas. You can see that both of those figures are quite a bit higher. So for humanities, science and maths, computing, etc., 40.8% of those who didn't undertake WIL reported they felt that they were overqualified, and 32% of those who had undertaken WIL. But there is still a difference. There is still an impact, and it behooves us all to do a bit more work on this, but it does make a difference to how they perceive their qualifications helping them and being applied in the full-time work that they get after they've completed their program. So the other thing, and I'm going to brave one of the tables that the wonderful Denise has prepped for you and put in here. Another thing that's worth looking at is the influence of work integrated learning on the sorts of occupations that students are in once they've completed their course. You can think about the SPOC as a bit of a proxy for the relevance of the job that they're in to the studies that they've undertaken. Occupations, the department consider a successful outcome to be where a student has landed in a preferably full-time occupation, but part-time is all right, in a professional or managerial occupation. Now, a thing to keep in mind for managerial occupations is that a manager in McDonald's is still a manager. So sometimes that could be a bit less direct a relationship, but certainly if you're looking at who's in professional occupations, gives you a bit of a sense of how, in inverted commas, successful that job outcome has been, and whether they are working at a level that is commensurate with a higher education qualification. So that's kind of how we're looking at it. And what you can see here is 73.9% of undergraduates who undertook any of those three forms of WIL are reporting that they are working full-time in managerial or professional occupations. So of those who are working full-time, 73.9% of them are working in managerial or professional occupations. And that's a big differential. You're looking at 12.2, I'm doing that off the top of my head, percentage points. So there is what appears to be something of an impact, but I say again, be careful of study area effects. It may be that this is because of the heavy preponderance of students in nursing, teaching, engineering, and those kinds of areas who are moving into jobs that are, by definition, professional occupations. So again, if looking at this, I would be breaking that down and looking at my different study areas rather than just treating everybody the same. So in terms of any employability-related activity, again, we're seeing similar things. There is about a 4.3% or percentage, oh no, hang on, I'm doing bad math. Oh yeah, 4.3 percentage point or something like that between those who participated and those who did not participate in any of those positions. Now, do keep in mind as well that it may be that a lot of these students are going on to further study, and so I would be using that variable as well, just to see, because volunteering is often an activity that's associated with things like humanities, social work, psychology, a lot of those more generalist areas. A lot of positions in responsibility in clubs and societies. Accounting students do a lot of that because they might be working in their local footy club or something like that to get their skills up. So it may be that some of those figures have study area effects as well. It's worth looking at. Again, you see the postgrad coursework, the difference is not as large. And I agree with Denise, it's likely because a lot of those students are already working in the area in which they're studying. They're either upskilling or adding to an undergraduate qualification. And so you see a lot of those students are probably already working in professional occupations when they've undertaken their further study. And those who haven't and would undertake those WIL activities are probably those who are still trying to break into their area of relevance. I've said before forever job, but I've been hauled over the coals. Not their forever job, but certainly the job that is their ultimate goal. And postgrad research, similar thing, there's a smallish effect, but there is an effect. And again, as Denise said, depends if those students are going from going into industrial jobs or into academia, which we know a lot of postgrad research students do have as an outcome and see as a positive one. So this is in all study areas, undergraduates who participated in any sort of WIL. And you can see that those who did participate in WIL were less likely than those who didn't to report that they're working in managerial positions. But they are substantially more likely, so 72% compared to 53.8. That's getting up towards your 20%. They are more likely to be in professional occupations. But again, I think look at study area before you make any rush to judgment on that. I think it's worth that for your context. If we just look at those areas where we're calling them elective WIL areas, so those study areas which were to the right of that grouping, humanities, creative arts, communications, those sorts of things, while the effect is smaller, there is still a substantial effect here. You're looking at what, at least 10 percentage points difference. And so work integrated learning of those three varieties, one or more of them, does seem to have an impact on whether students are in professional occupations. But it's really an association. We can't say that one leads to another. It may just be that people who are more likely to get professional occupations are more likely to have done WIL as well. But certainly there's some interesting stuff there that warrants further discussion and further investigation. Yes, I agree. It's not a causal relationship. Those two things are happening at the same time. But I think you now have some data in which you can start to look at which direction those things are related to. You can relate any of those items in your ACEN set to any of the other items and indicators in the survey, and so it's well worth a little dig in there to see what you can make out. So certainly, I'm going to hand it back to Denise.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so just reiterating, this was really one of the earlier slides about key takeaways. It's a bit of a recap, and hopefully, the data you can understand the conclusions that we've come to based on the data that's been presented. So we have seen that quite clear positive effect of full-time employment, particularly at an undergraduate level, and certainly for workplace-based WIL that seem to have a greater effect perhaps than that which is not based in the workplace. We didn't see that impact at the postgraduate level, and that would be coursework and also for research as well. In terms of perceptions of overqualification, that was quite clear, particularly at the undergraduate level, but also at the course level, the potential benefits of WIL. We can also see about the employability-related activities, there were some differences there. And I think also the comment that you made in there, Jason, in the chat function is absolutely bang on. People do things for different reasons, and individuals do things for different reasons. And just reiterating that we are focused on employment, and largely full-time employment and graduate level employment, and not employability, which is, you know, another very rich area where students might engage in activities and it might assist them. And even in building their perceived employability and confidence can be, you know, very, very worthwhile. And in terms of there were some impacts there, or some associations between employability-related activities and perceived overqualification, but it did vary in terms of the types of activities that were undertaken. And so I think really drilling down at an institution level, because we're all different in terms of what we facilitate and what we embed with our students in terms of employability related activities, and you know, whether they're extracurricular, co-curricular, etc. I think that's, you know, really pertinent to drill down into your own data and find your own story with regards to those. But certainly embedding WIL into undergraduate curriculum, there does seem to be a clear association, and more so with overqualification than with full-time employment. And, you know, without jumping to, this is 1 year's worth of data, so trying to look and see how that changes next year, and then tracking that over a few years, hopefully we'll be able to get a clearer picture of the relative value of WIL compared with employability related activities. But again, that could be institution specific, and also, as Lisa highlighted, it could be discipline specific. So just in terms of implications, obviously there does seem to be some value in embedding WIL into core curricula. We know that WIL is embedded, but I mean, to the extent the extent to which it's embedded varies by discipline. As Lisa said, there are some areas where WIL remains selective. And also, you know, you could embed WIL and it could be scaffolded through the degree rather than having a capstone experience, which tends to be what happens in a lot of areas where WIL is non-accredited and elective. In terms of harnessing the true value of WIL and the whole pedagogy surrounding it, making sure that there's those quality principles built into WIL design, so, you know, around reflection, feedback, and so forth, and ensuring WIL is inclusive. And accessed by all. And I know in the non-accredited areas where WIL is largely elective, sometimes there are limitations on students in terms of prerequisites. They have to have a certain academic mark or GPA for entry, which is frankly a shame. And we've removed that from our own programs a few years ago. And, you know, we focus rather on other criteria such as work ethic, and, you know, employability skills and that type of thing. I think every student has something to offer, and trying to make it accessible for all so they can harness these benefits that we've outlined would be useful. In terms of postgraduate WIL, reviewing its purpose, but really I think being mindful of the cohort, and if they are in employment, so they're not taking up those opportunities to participate in WIL and employability related activities, that, you know, that might be absolutely fine. So in which case it's continuing on as is. But again, drilling down by at an institution level and by discipline level would be useful. And I guess throwing it out there, we have seen workplace-based WIL has been highlighted throughout as being having perhaps stronger effects than the other forms of WIL, not necessarily global, but non-workplace-based WIL. You know, that does require resourcing, not just about, you know, matching students to placements and so forth, but also building staff capacity to make sure they can deliver those quality programs. And lastly, considering whether institutional policies and procedures will support innovative WIL that is accessible for all. And I think with respect to the employability-related activities, which might often sit in the careers and employability areas, I know there's a long-standing push, quite rightly so, for embedding career development learning into the curriculum and making it more accessible for all. And there were some really, you know, strong associations there, particularly around mentoring and around the ward programs, which is really good to see, you know, in terms of the benefits that they can offer. And, you know, I think that's a takeaway message as well for institutions to consider outside of the WIL space. In terms of what ACEN can do going forward, it's really important that we continue showcasing good practice of WIL and how they can be embedded into core curricula. So if you're not familiar with the website and the resources, we do have a whole area dedicated to case studies on good, really, showcasing good practice in WIL. So do have a look at those, because there's some good examples there. And also facilitating professional development on embedding WIL, that's accessible by all and high quality. We have a whole suite of webinars, critical conversations, informal learning, networking activities where you can engage with others and also get some, not formal instruction, but some real key tips and tricks on quality WIL design, and also the WIL framework, the quality WIL framework that was funded by ACEN a couple of years ago, or just over a year ago, and that's under review, and we're hoping to expand on that in the coming months. Supporting further research that explores some of these key takeaways. Obviously, the data we're gathering at the moment, so we'll have more data, which means we can track these things rather than, draw conclusions on one wave or one year's worth of data, as it were. But we do have our research grants, and we do have our commission project, which I think they've been announced. I should know if they've been announced, but if they haven't, they will be shortly. So we are doing our best to support research, and some of this is, around some of the takeaways that we've spoken about here. Just some limitations and caveats. I've mentioned about the employment and not the employability thing, which is important. The 4 to 6 month post-graduation timeline has been hotly debated, but it is what it is, and that's the data that we're working with. Lisa touched on a point earlier about some of the disciplines where WIL is mandatory. We know it's part of the course, so education, nursing, for example. We would have expected to have seen 100% of those graduates saying, yes, I completed WIL as part of my course. It might have been predominantly workplace-based, but we would have expected to have seen that. And we found in the data that wasn't the case. It might be, for example, that only 3/4 said that they were participating in WIL, which resulting in an undercount in some of those disciplines. We have addressed this. We think the issue was that the wording that we used in the first item was participating in 4 academic credit WIL. So some individuals might perceive that as, actually doing an actual unit of study, which gives you accrues credit points, rather than it being just a mandatory component or an elective, a mandatory component of the course for those particular disciplines. So we have changed that wording, which will be introduced in the next years when we're in field. So just so you're aware that there is an undercount. If you see it in the summary report, that's probably why. And also just to flag the small sample sizes for a couple of those employability-related activities, particularly with the enterprise incubators and the micro-credential programs. And I think that's all we'd planned to present on. So we have around 10 minutes for questions. So it's back to Erin to manage that.
Great, thank you, Denise, and thank you, Lisa. Lots of interesting information there. There's probably one question and a couple of comments. Are we able to access the data that underlies the summary report?
Yes. I know I said I'd wait, but I'll jump in. It's Lisa here. Every institution got their graduate outcomes survey data as an SPSS file and a CSV file, and also in Tableau. Now the ACEN data is included in your SPSS files and in your Excel files. So your institution has your institution's answers to all of those ACEN questions, and that data is distributed to the survey managers who look after QUILT. So if you're after the data or you want somebody looking at it, it's your survey areas that are holding it, but definitely you have it.
Thank you.
We had a comment also about salary ranges of graduates. Is there any work being done in terms of how the impact of WIL and ERAs relate to salary ranges?
There was data. We chose not to present on that because of time, but there is some information in the summary report around the impact of WIL and also the ERAs on salary. And I'll be honest, I think in terms of WIL, the positive result that we found for undergraduates was that we found that for labour market participation, but we found little effect or little association with salary from memory. But I'd have to go back and look at the data, but it's in the summary report. There is some detail there around the effect on salary.
And institutions then would be able to drill down into their own data.
Yeah.
Okay, great. This is probably more of a comment and perhaps to you, Denise, from Jason around, do you think that WIL experiences give students more realistic feedback on where they're placed in the workplace, and then perhaps then they perceive themselves not to be overqualified compared to people who perhaps have not had those experiences?
Sorry, I'm not sorry. Can you just repeat that? I'm not clear on the question. Sorry.
So do you think that a WIL experience gives students more realistic feedback on where they're placed in the workplace, and therefore they perceive themselves not to be overqualified compared to ones who haven't?
Okay, so I think what Jason's getting at there, I suppose, is that you're receiving feedback when you're placed in terms of your skills and abilities, that you're rated on those, you're evaluated on those, and you get feedback from industry partners throughout. So when you then proceed into the workplace in your current role, you have a clearer understanding of where your capabilities are, so you're less likely to feel that you're overqualified. Yes, possibly, although I think the focus of this question, and Lisa might be able to jump in here, is really around their current role and what they're doing in their current role, as opposed, and obviously there is some recall bias perhaps there as well, depending on when they undertook their WIL placements. But I think by then, if graduates have worked in a role for 6 months, whether they've done WIL or not, I think they would be perhaps arguably on an equal footing in terms of the skills they have and the role that they're doing. So I see the point of the question, but I mean, I'm not able to say yay or no, but possibly there could be a connection there. I don't know if Lisa has something to add.
I think all of the above. The get out of jail free answer. I think that students who've done those work integrated learning activities have a different set of expectations when they've hit a workplace, because they've already experienced a lot of that, of those employability issues about getting there, knowing what to expect, etc. But it also may be a reflection of the fact that they're more likely to be in professional occupations that are related to the studies that they were doing. So again, those things seem to be associated, but we can't say what is driving what. And so I think there's a lot more work to be done. Anyone who's a bit of a stats guru, do get into the data and have a look. Happy to advise. But certainly there's more work to be done to start to tease out a lot of this, because you've got a lot of data now to be playing with. And we've only touched the surface on one of the outcomes, on employment outcomes, which are not necessarily driven by the WIL, but it seem to be affecting the nature of their employment outcome and how they're into it.
And it will be interesting to look at next time when we're looking at the impact of WIL and the employability-related activities and the variations within, perhaps, on the graduate attributes, the scale that's included in the GOS, or it was for the year that we're presenting on, and seeing the impact there, and also that sense of feeling prepared for future or for work, because that's just as rich as whether they got a full-time job 4 to 6 months post-graduation, overall employment. You know, there is that argument there. So this is, as I said before, this is absolutely not to detract and take away from the value of non-workplace-based WIL, which on paper didn't look as strong, I suppose, and also things like volunteering. There's lots of other factors at play here. We know how complex employability is, and we know all those mediating factors between employability and employment, which also, we simply can't obviously present on all of that today. But I guess this just purpose was to give you some overarching themes, but also to highlight some areas that you might want to dig down into as well.
Thank you. I mean, I think it will also, as we go through the years, obviously you were saying before that this is only one year's worth of data. moving through this year and next year, and seeing any impact of COVID and the downturn in certain markets too will be interesting there. We have one more question, and then I think we might leave it there. Lisa has asked, can you please comment on the findings related to participation in WIL by SES status?
Yeah, I saw that, Lisa, and we will absolutely be looking at that. Our plan is to do a second webinar on the influence on employability and different dimensions of, and then we also plan a later webinar drilling down into participation in WIL among and variations by equity groups. So we do plan to look at that. It's an area that ACEN is keen to focus on. We'll get there eventually. We're wading through a lot of data, but there will be something planned later in the year.
Yep, and institutions are holding all of that information for their own institution, including all of the outcomes and indicators from the GOS, but also all of the demographics related to socioeconomic status, gender. You even have in there international versus domestic, etc. So it's worth getting onto your surveys area and starting them thinking about that data and what you can do with it and pull it through. And there's probably a lot of papers in it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lisa and Denise. Thank you for taking time out of your day. We had just over 150 people attend, so thank you to everybody else for taking time out of your day. We are going to